Hello everyone! Nicole here, just enjoying and sharing the intersection of two of my favorite things, knitting and books. Today's knitting book review is a book I checked out from the Watertown Free Public Library called Jorid Linvik's Big Book of Knitted Socks, 45 Distinctive Scandinavian Patterns. It's a pretty fun book. All these socks on the cover drew me in. I don't know if it's just me or if anyone else experiences this, but there's something about transitioning to fall that makes me want to knit socks. And this seemed like a great book to jump into this fall. So what does this book cover? The beginning section, there's a preface, has some information about her family history with knitting, and then it jumps into some of the resources and tips and tricks that she has before all the patterns. So this book doesn't have a resource section at the end. All of that stuff is at the beginning of the book. She goes over basic knitting techniques. This includes ribbing, the stuff that you do usually at the top of the sock to help it stay on your leg, dominance of color. This is something that we talked about a little bit before in my alternate stitch dictionary book review, but so this has a lot of color work in it. If you look at the socks, like where they're using more than one color at a time, which one is kind of popping out, that's the dominant color. So she goes over some information about that, and also the tension and how that affects dominance of color, making sure you're holding them the same way each time. She also goes over wrong side. So in color work, with most knitting projects, you have a front side or a right side and the back side or the wrong side, or the inside in this case with socks. So what does that look like? What's different and unique about socks with other projects? Also really helpful information that she has there. And related to that are the long floats. So floats are when you're using more than one color, you're only knitting with one of them at a time, and the one that you're not knitting is stretched across the back. That's called a float. So she goes over some stuff with that. I always find it helpful to get information from more than one person when you're doing that kind of thing, because something's going to click or resonate with you. So it's helpful that all these books have this information in them. Splicing your yarn, or that's when you're transitioning from one ball to another. She gives some good tips and tricks about that and why it's important to do it right. And the duplicate stitch. This is a cool subject that I'm really glad she put in there. So when you're knitting and color work, sometimes you want just one small part of something to be a color. And I'd never thought about this, but you could intentionally use the duplicate stitch after to add that additional color or splash of color that you might want. More interesting to me personally was when she talked about how to use duplicate stitch to go ahead and fix a mistake you'd made. So if you were supposed to switch from one color to the other and you didn't, you can fix that afterwards using duplicate stitch. Pretty cool. And then she rounds out the basic knitting section talking about weaving in ends and joining with Kitchener stitch. So weaving in ends is an important part of finishing off any project, and the Kitchener stitch is something that's more specific to socks. You might use it in other things, but it's used very frequently when you're doing top-down socks. It's how you connect your toe so that it looks like you were knitting the whole time there. The second section of the book goes over yarn and yarn suppliers. So she tells you all the yarn she used to make the sample socks that she photographed and put in there, and then also has some links to places that you could go to get similar yarn. You can find something similar, and she talks you kind of through how to do that and good places that she would recommend to do that. The third section at the beginning of this book talks about gauge. So gauge can be a controversial topic among knitters. Some people really like figuring out how exactly to make their project match what the designer has done. For some things, it doesn't matter so much. If you're making a blanket or a scarf, it can be wider or skinnier than what they had planned, and it's not really going to affect it. But with socks, if it's a little too small or too big, they might not actually fit yourself or whoever you're making them for. So it's useful to pay attention to gauge here. She reminds us that gauge, what she said is, simply put, gauge affects the size of every single stitch. So all of your stitches are going to be bigger or smaller, closer together or further apart, depending on the tension you use, the size of the needles, and the width of the yarn. But we can't really measure every individual stitch. That's why we tend to do 4x4 square gauges to help you determine how your stitches are working with that yarn and those needles. And that if you're doing the sock in a color work pattern, it's going to be tighter. So switching back and forth between different colors will bring your stitches closer together. So just keeping that in mind, which I also hadn't really thought about. So that was useful information, helpful to think about going into making some color work socks. The last thing in that section that she has is actually a 5-step process for making sure you produce the right size socks while you're knitting them. And it's really helpful. I really liked that part of it and think that it's something that would be really helpful to refer back to when making socks, whether they're color work or not. The 4th section builds on the idea of gauge and has to do with sizing and measurement. So once you know how your stitches, the needles and yarn, my new word I just created there, how the needles and yarn work together with your stitching, then you also need to think about how it's going to fit the individual. So this is a really great thing if you're making socks for yourself. You can try them on while you're making them and make sure they fit how you want them to. You can add a little bit more length and you make them the perfect size for you. If you're making them for someone else, something that you can do is have somebody trace their foot on a piece of paper, and then you can use that to measure. Additionally, I hadn't thought about this so much before, but so the length matters, and that's part of what you get from having a picture or a piece of paper with it drawn on there. But the other thing that matters is how wide around your sock is going to be. So if you have really wide feet, you need more stitches going around the bottom part than if you have really narrow feet. You don't need as many stitches for it to fit as well. So if you're making more like tube socks, that might not matter quite as much. They'll just come up higher or lower on your leg. But if you're making them with the heel, which most of the socks in this book do, then that's more important, making sure you have the right amount to go around the foot as well as the length of the foot. And I also, again, back to making these for yourself, this is also helpful depending on how high or low you want the socks to go. So if it's going up further up your calf, or if it's staying lower, that may determine a little bit how wide you need the socks to be. And here again, she has a great tip for this. So if your leg is wide, I have this problem, like I can't wear most boots because they're not wide enough for my legs. But she recommended just using a larger needle size for that part of the sock. And then you can switch to a smaller needle size when you get down to your ankle and heel. I thought that was a really great suggestion that I want to definitely test out. Section 5, how to follow charts in this book. This is also really helpful. So there's charts that are used to show how to do the various color work patterns. And for the most part, they're pretty typical and they are color coded. So if you're supposed to be knitting in color A, it's one color. If you're knitting in color B, it's another color, which is also very helpful. Something that I have not seen in charts before, but that I really like that she does, is she has vertical lines. So you go up the chart showing you where she's recommending that you switch your needle. So if you're knitting with double pointed needles, she has a line showing you this should be on one needle, and then the next section would be on your next needle, and the next section for all 4 of the needles, the way that she has it lined up. And Not only that, she recommended that if you're not using double pointed needles, so if you're doing this on circular needles, you can put a stitch marker there and it will help you keep track and make sure that you're still on the correct pattern so that you end up with the end product that you want, not having to use that duplicate stitch trick to correct something that you did wrong. So those vertical lines are really helpful. Also, these socks are mostly done in the round. So often when if you're doing a flat knit chart, you knit across one way and then coming back the opposite direction, you're knitting when it shows a dot, which on the right side is a purl, and you're purling when you see a square, which on the right side is a knit. But since you're going in a circle, the only time that would apply is on the heel when you're going back and forth to do the heel flap. But instead of doing it that way, she wrote it the correct way, but just has a little arrow showing you're going to be reading across the opposite way of the chart, but doing the same kind of stitch that you would. So very helpful. If I just dived in and started doing the patterns without reading the instructions, I probably would have missed that and wondered why I had these very strange looking heel flaps. Section 6, abbreviations. This is a pretty small part of this book, but it's one that would probably be referenced back to regularly. So one of the things that I like to do for those kinds of sections, I might for this book also do it for the chart, how to read the charts, but I just add a little post-it note. So I have the book, and then on that page, I just put a post-it note so that I can easily flip to the page. I'm not going to show copyrighted material, but that's what I do. Just have a little post-it note on the side so that I can flip to that page pretty easily. All right, now for the socks. The majority of the book, the main reason we're looking at this one, all of these awesome socks. So the very first thing she does is have a baby sock, and she has 3 or 4 variations where you can add a little flair to it, but also practice doing all the skills that you would need for anything else on a small baby sock project. And then the main sections are mama socks, mother-in-law socks, and Russian socks. So mama socks, these are ones that her mother actually taught her as a child to make and demonstrated doing it for her. And then she wrote down this pattern. So there's a couple of basic ones, socks for him, socks for her. They have a stripe on them, which is pretty fun. And then she created some really cool designs and patterns and wrote those patterns up for us so that we can also try out these traditional sock patterns to use from her mom with some modern flair. And then there's the mother-in-law socks. So these are actually ones that her mother-in-law taught her, and the main difference is in the heel. So it has a very different heel construction, and she said these are specifically really great for wearing in boots. So they don't have lines up the side of the heel where you're doing the increasing, and so they don't get, even if they get twisted, you're not going to be stepping on or putting strain on a less reinforced part of the heel. So you can make some boot socks using the mother-in-law option. And then there's the Russian socks. So these ones are knit also very differently in the heel, and they're not knit to fit. So they're I don't actually know exactly what that means. I'm very curious to kind of test one of those out. But the piece of advice that stuck out to me when I was reading through that was to be extra sure not to knit them too tight, because you are not knitting them to fit. So in order to pull them up over the heel, it needs to not be too tight so that it can maneuver in that way. Tips and tricks. This is a big reason that I like reading through the books and just learning some information from people who've spent a lot of time doing something. You learn new things. Tip number 1. If you make a mistake and the error is obvious, rip back and start over. Ripping back is frustrating and takes time, but it can often take just as much time to adjust a pattern to compensate for a mistake. I think that's really great advice. I don't always go back and fix mistakes of mine. Sometimes I decide just to incorporate them and have them be a part of my unique project that I'm doing. And I think that's great. But I do also value this approach. Something that I've learned is that if there's a mistake that's throwing things off enough that I'm constantly trying to figure out, where am I in the pattern? How does this fit in? I spend so much time trying to figure that out that I would be better off just going back and fixing it. If you're not going to be happy with how it looks in the end and you're trying to fuss around with it, sometimes just taking it out, ripping back a few rows or a lot of rows will end up saving you time and making you happier with your end project. Tip number 2. It's a good idea to write down the results of your gauge swatch to make it easier the next time. When you become more experienced, you'll be able to look at a pattern and know what yarn and needle size you can probably use for it. I also really value this feedback or tip because I always think to myself, man, I wish I remembered how that worked the last time. So especially in this case, if you want to do multiple projects from the same book or using very similar yarn, having somewhere that you wrote that down, and if you're working out of a book, you could actually, or a printed pattern, you could actually write information on it. Don't do it if it's a library book, but if you own it and that's what you want to do, that works great. Or my favorite trusty friend Post-it notes are a good thing. You can put them on that page, make your notes on it, and have that to reference back to. Or if you have a knitting notebook or a note on your phone where you like to keep track of things, those are all good options so that when you're making your next pair of socks, you don't have to do swatches to figure that out again, or at least you can start with the same one and just double check using that as your base, the information you already have from your other project. Tip number 3. This one is about stripes on socks, which we mentioned in the Socks for Her from Mama Sock pattern. Stripes also liven up the socks and are a good way to use up some leftover yarn. If you want the socks to match exactly, it's a good idea to weigh that leftover yarn and divide it in half. That way you can be sure you have enough to work both socks the same way. What a good idea! And also a great way to use a kitchen scale. So if you weigh that ball of yarn, figure out how many ounces it is, and then divide it in half. And one trick for the way to do that, so if you have your ball of yarn, you weigh it, you don't need to figure out so that they look the same really. You just start rolling a second ball from that yarn and then weigh your second ball or either one of them, until it's half of the amount, with the other ball just sitting next to the scale, not on it. And then you'll be able to use up some leftover yarn and add some unique elements to the socks that you're making. Favorite quotes. Quote number 1. Sock knitting was considered, for the most part, women's work. That was an old and long-standing tradition, but it still held true. It almost counted as laziness if you just sat down with your hands in your lap. While I don't think that knitting or making socks needs to be women's work, I did laugh at that part about it being almost considered laziness if you had your hands in your lap. My grandma had this mentality. I don't even know if it's mentality, but this practice. She had knitting with her all of the time. And she actually used to use this old pail that she had suckers in before. And she would have her knitting in there and she'd carry it around. If she's in the car, she'd pull it out and she would knit. If she was at our family reunion, she'd have it sitting next to her and she'd be knitting. Not always making socks, but anyway, it was just really fun that this family tradition or generational thing that I could share that. Quote number 2. I was an adult before I realized that not only sweaters and cardigans, but also socks could be embellished with different colors and patterns. I also thought that was pretty cool. So if you, like me, hadn't realized this, we're also just like Jorid, and we're in good company. You can be an adult and learn new things, test out new skills, and do so in great company. 2 questions to answer. First, how likely am I to check out this book again? Pretty likely. I marked 13 pair of socks that I'd be interested in making for myself or for somebody else. So the odds of my making at least 1 or 2 of them is pretty good, and we'll just see how fast I knit, if I need to check out the book again or if I can get it done on time. Question number 2. Who would I recommend this book to? I'd recommend this book to advanced knitters or plucky intermediate knitters. There are a couple of basic patterns in this book, basic for socks. So you could definitely do those as an intermediate knitter, but I know I would be disappointed if I checked out this book and I only had the skills or confidence to do the basic patterns. There's so many awesome patterns in here. I'd want to do some other socks first before jumping into this book, I think. Or be pretty experienced with color work. If you're pretty experienced with color work, then adding socks on top of that would be fine. But if you don't have experience with socks or color work, maybe do a couple other patterns first and then check out this awesome book. All right, if you enjoyed this knitting book, give me a like or subscribe to my channel. Both of those are easy ways to support my work, and make sure you get to see other things that come out in the future, more knitting book reviews or videos about the projects that I'm doing from these awesome books from the library. Do you have a recommendation for a book I should check out and review? Leave it in the comments below. I'd love to see them and check out other options. And remember, the library has lots of resources that you can use to improve your skills or test something out, and to do so without spending so much money on this hobby that can be expensive depending on how you do it. Until next time, happy knitting!